Hello, I am William J. Mullen.
I'm going to cut this part out since I'm not sitting in, so don't worry about it. So, okay. So, all right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Mullen Expounds. Going to take a departure from the short format for today, since we have a special episode. This is an interview with my father, William James Mullen, Jr. So I wanted to undertake this interview because my father has cancer, is going to be with us for an indefinite amount of time, but probably not too much longer in the long run. And I have some grandchildren that I want to know his voice and know his face and all of those things. Plus, I personally feel like I don't know my own father very well. It's been 24 years since I left the household. I'm sure he's changed a lot in that time, and me being so self-absorbed, I probably didn't understand him all that well when I did live in the household. So this will be a good opportunity for all of us to learn a little bit more about this wonderful, fascinating man. So, welcome, Dad.
They're my grandchildren.
Yes, his grandchildren, my children. So we may as well just get started from the beginning. Where and when were you born? Tell us about your life as a child and all of that.
I was born in Hancock, Michigan.
Notice the very deep voice, though, by the way. Great radio voice. Kids love it.
Hancock, Michigan, St. Joseph's Hospital at 9:20 a.m. on the 21st of September, 1944.
1944. Today is March 21st?
Second.
March 22nd, 2011. So that would make my father 65 years old.
66 and a half.
66 and a half. I stand corrected.
Exactly. Yesterday.
All right, 66.5 and change.
Yes.
Okay, so born in Hancock, Michigan. So what was your life like as a child? What did your parents do for a living? And
Well, I was
that?
born in Hancock because my father was in China building the Burma Road, or helping build the Burma Road. He was a civil engineer and a captain in the Army.
Okay.
So I was born basically at my mother's home. After she got out of the hospital. We lived at her house, her mother's house, father's house, until Dad got home from the Army in 1946. And shortly thereafter we moved, I was told, by train to Grand Island, Nebraska.
Oh, okay.
Where my father, as a civil engineer, worked for the Bureau of Reclamation and participated in planning and building several irrigation dams on the Middle Loop River, the Calamus River, and the South Loop River.
So how old were you when you moved to Grand Island?
2.
2, okay. So
I don't remember much.
yeah, I was going to say, probably don't remember Hancock at all. So
Not at that time. I've seen pictures of me with my grandfather, but they all died before I have memories.
And so was this the famous 1720 Grand Island Avenue house?
No, it was Broadwell Courts. Broadwell Courts were actually railroad cars with the wheels taken off, made into one-bedroom apartments.
Wow, but they don't sound very big.
They weren't very big, but they were very cheap. And at
There you
that
go.
time, that was what was important.
True indeed.
Okay. Now, I have a sister, Margaret, who was born a little more than 2 years after I was. And by the time she was born, we were living on 15th Street. Don't remember the exact address, but it wasn't, it was 1 block off of Broadwell, Main Street in Grand Island. And we lived there for, I think, about 3 years. I do remember having a dog named Red Riley, who was an Irish setter. And my sister Margaret and I would tie a rope around his neck. There were no dog laws in those days. Tie a rope around his neck and have the other side on the tricycle and have him pull us down the sidewalk.
Oh, what fun.
Yeah, right until the time he went through a hedge.
Hmm.
And
Yeah,
then
that's
my
fun.
mother said that's the end of that. From my face was completely scratched.
I can imagine. How old were you at that point again?
5, maybe 6.
Excellent. Good age to be busting your face up.
And then
Big
shortly
deal.
after that, my father bought a house on Park Street,
Okay.
17 something Park Street, and we lived there until 1956. And I know that we bought that house before the winter of 1949. I know that.
Okay.
Because in Nebraska there was a blizzard, 1949, that is epic. You can look it up.
Really?
Out on the plains, drifts covered telephone poles.
Wow.
In our neighborhood, drifts covered stop signs. All except the stop sign that was a block down from our house, which the wind completely twisted around.
Well.
And I also remember my father getting dressed and going out in the storm with a cardboard box, which he was using as a sled. He was on his way to the grocery store. And he did make it back. The grocery store was about 5 blocks away. And he did make it back, this time carrying the box on a sled.
Ah.
He bought a sled. And after he did that, when he was shoveling the driveway, because I mean it was 3 or 4 feet deep in snow, he threw it all up on one side and we built a slide, a ramp.
Oh, very clever.
And so cut steps in the snow, and my dad would take the hot water from the house and pour it down the slide, so the slide became ice.
Ah.
And we would get up there with the sled, had to make sure there were no cars coming, because you went out across the street from the neighbor's front yard, across the street.
Wow, what fun. We'll have
Yeah.
to try that one of these days. Calvin really enjoyed the mini blizzard that we had a few weeks ago.
Yeah, that was, I remember that very well. And then we moved, I started school at West Lawn Elementary,
Okay.
kindergarten, went to kindergarten, 1st and 2nd grade. By that time, the Blessed Sacrament Catholic Church had built their own school, and so I went to the 4th and 5th grades at Blessed Sacrament,
Okay.
and then we moved to Sargent, Nebraska,
Oh, did not know that.
and we lived in Sargent, Nebraska for about 3 years. Sargent, Nebraska is on the southern edge of the sand hills of Nebraska. 810 people. Many fond memories of Sargent, Nebraska. Sargent, Nebraska was a town where the only time you locked your house was when you were in it. Because if you left and your neighbor needed something and couldn't get in, that's a shame.
Right.
You gotta do that. I would guess that on the street that at least half the cars had the keys in ignition. Windows down. No problem.
Wow.
No problem.
What a picture of America. Definitely not the way it is these days.
I tell a story, made up story, but would have been very real at the time. That if the principal looked out his window, well, start over. If there were 100 cars in the parking lot, and there never were. I mean, we didn't have that many students. But the country kids could get a driver's license at 14 to drive to and from school. And oftentimes they would hunt their way to school, or stop off at the pond and shoot a few ducks, or get a few pheasants or quail or something. And they would often show each other at, when they got to school.
Wow.
So
So
they
they
had to
arrested
get-
for terrorism these days.
Well, they had to get some ice and so on. So they would be showing each other their shotguns. And if the school principal had seen that out of the window of his office, he would have run down there immediately, gone to his car, got his shotgun, and brought it over, and they're all comparing. That's the difference of what it is today,
Right, well, and the difference between country culture and city culture,
I suppose.
for sure. Yeah, very interesting.
It was.
So then when did you move back to Grand Island?
I was in October of 1958. I was partway through my freshman year in high school, and Dad, that project was completed. In fact, it was completed before we moved back to Grand Island, and my father worked in Enid, Oklahoma for 8 or 9 months, waiting for a job. He wanted a job in Nebraska. We didn't want to leave. So Mom and the 6 children, one of which was a year, my youngest sister Patty, was probably a year old or so. George would have been 6. John 8 or 9. Kathy 11. Margaret 13. Me 14. Something like that.
Right.
Those dates may not be exact. In Sargent, we lived in 2 different houses. But the big thing that happened to me at Sargent was I was riding horses shortly after school got out with a friend out on his farm, and this was a little 1-year-old filly who was being broken to ride, and so we would ride it as often as we could, but she still bucked and so on. And I was riding her around the pasture the last time, and then took off straight to the barn, across the pasture, and she came to a gopher hole, or maybe a prairie dog hole, and she went that way, and I went that way,
Uh-oh.
and I broke my arm that came out right there.
Wow, still got a scar.
And
Yeah, sticking out.
and the bone went right into a pile of dried cow poop.
Ew.
This was Bruce Kostler's house in the country, and he ran in and told his mother that I broke my arm. We had to go to town, and she came out and saw my arm with the bone sticking out and the blood and the cow poop, and she vomited.
Understandable.
And so she went in and got a towel to wrap around it so she didn't have to look at it.
Okay.
And off we went to town, got my mother, went to the hospital. The one doctor in Sargent, whose name was, can't remember, Mac, oh, it was Owen. His name was Owen, his last name was Owen, because his son Mac was part of my wolf patrol. Mac Owen, Phil Brown, Fred Almberger, and me.
Just like young Boy Scouts.
Boy Scout, right. So, because a farmer gave us 3 acres on the Middle Loop River that was only 3 miles out of town.
Just gave you
was-
3 acres?
Pardon?
Just gave you 3 acres of land?
Right. It was 3 acres.
Nice.
We had to fence it, keep the cattle out. So we did, built wood fences, you know, Boy Scout stuff. And another farmer gave us a building that was maybe 9 by 12. And so they put it on telephone poles and dragged it from his house down to the Boy Scout camp.
Wow.
And it was
Your own little country.
It was not uncommon. It was not uncommon. Remember, I did 6th, 7th, 8th, and part of my 9th grade year there. It was not uncommon. Now, the year I was 12 and had the broken arm, it was harder for me to play baseball because I could only swing with one
Would
hand,
probably
and
put a dent in your game.
I had catch and then drop the glove, get the ball, throw. That didn't mean I didn't play every day.
Right.
It means it was a little tougher. They've had to replace the cast 4 times because I also went swimming. Not a good thing.
I've gotten a cast wet before. It itches like crazy, so
Yeah.
I can imagine.
So I had put a hole right here and had a corset stay. It's like a nail file, except it's smooth. You don't cut yourself,
Right.
and you can get down in there and scratch. Yeah.
Refreshing.
Oh, baby. I got off on that because at the time, my dad had our only car in Oklahoma, where he was in Enid, Oklahoma. And the doctor looked at my arm and said, "There's no way I can do this. I'm not touching this. You got to go to Grand Island." We didn't have a car. So one neighbor said, "I'll drive you." Another neighbor said, "Wait a minute, I got some cookies you can take." And another neighbor said, "Wait a minute, I just made some iced tea. Take it with you." Off we drove to Grand Island. The Dr. House there set my bone just fine. They picked as much cow poop out of it as they could, and the shards, and put it back together. And I got lockjaw, tetanus.
Ah, yeah, that poop.
Yeah, it's hard to avoid tetanus when you got it, in your bone.
And your marrow. And yeah.
And so I got a shot of penicillin. It seemed to me every 30 minutes, but it was probably every 4 hours, because that's the dose. But okay, so that's the broken arm story.
Right.
My dad drove home to Sargent, and we bought another car. It was a Studebaker, and stick shift Studebaker, a green color, ugly green color. But at least we had a car now, and Dad had to go back to Enid, Oklahoma, and go back to work. Eventually, I think 9 or 10 months, he got the job he wanted in St. Paul, Nebraska. But we wanted to move back to Grand Island, which was 20 miles away from St. Paul, and at that time, that was a heck of a commute.
Really?
Yeah. Nowadays,
Yeah, that's not that.
Yeah, it's nothing for me. But in those days, my God, you had to drive all the way to St. Paul to go to work.
Right.
Anyway, when an old neighbor, our across the alley neighbor, Mrs. Woodruff, heard that we were coming back, she called my father and asked him if he would like to buy her house at 1720 North Grand Island Avenue, because she had refused to sell it. Lots of people wanted to buy it. She had refused to sell it because none of them had enough children to appreciate this 5-bedroom, 2-story, 2-fireplace house.
Wow.
She and her husband had 8 children, and she just wouldn't sell it to anybody. But she sold it to my father.
Wow, that's great. As an aside, that is the house that I always remember, that I grew up in at certain points in Grand Island. And yeah, a beautiful giant house with lots of great fun nooks and crannies, great attic that I used to love,
Yeah.
Patio out back with a huge backyard, gigantic trees, really fun place to live and grow up.
An outdoor sleeping porch off of one of the bedrooms.
Right, in George's room, as I remember it.
And a big side porch if you wanted to take advantage of it. And that was the side where the chimney was, so it was a perfect place to bounce the baseball and catch it if you didn't have anybody to play with.
Uh-huh.
Because it was all fake.
Excellent. So now I seem to remember as you're telling the story that you lived in a house across the alley
Yeah.
from
Yeah.
that, and that was the when was that? That was earlier
That
before
was
you
the
went
Park
to Sargent.
Street house.
Okay.
That was the first house my father bought.
Okay. Because I remember you planted a tree there or something.
I
It
planted-
was gigantic when I saw it.
I dug with a shovel a stub of a maple tree from a friend of ours' yard, this Bradley.
Mm-hmm.
I asked for it, and so I took home a shovel full of dirt with 3 twigs sticking out, and planted it in the front yard, protected it, watered it, and the first time you saw it, it was probably 60, 70 feet tall. Those 3 little sprigs all were this big, and it shaded the front of that house. Perfect.
Well, excellent. Yeah, it was a beautiful tree. I had to remember having a hard time wrapping my head around the fact that you planted it. It's
Yeah.
so giant, so gigantic.
Yep.
So let's take just 1 minute. I want to check the camera and just make sure that we're not wasting all of this. It hasn't somehow turned off or anything. Okay, we're still in good shape. Excellent.
Good.
All right. So, what were your parents like?
My father was a civil engineer, graduated from Michigan Tech University. Did it all on athletic and ROTC scholarships. He played football and hockey. In 1937, he was captain of the Michigan Tech hockey team.
Is he as tall as you are, or we are? Or
Pardon?
was he as tall as you are? Or
No, he was
what
5
kind of
feet
stature?
9.
Okay.
He was 5 feet. When I knew him, he was 5 feet 9 and weighed 210 pounds.
Okay.
He was a hockey defenseman. He told me that he never lost a tooth, but he had his nose broken 14 times.
Must have had that knack for ducking right
I
at the
guess.
right moment.
I have no idea. He did say he got his nose broken once by a fan with a hockey stick as he walked off the ice.
Mm,
So,
those crazy fanatics.
yeah. He taught me how to play football. The coaches that I had in high school were not football coaches. They could line you up.
At Mighty Central Catholic High?
Yeah.
They had a good football team back then.
We did.
But they didn't know how to coach.
And
Very
that was
strange.
that was mostly because Don Dubas and Bob Tesmer could run like the wind, and all I had to do was knock down the defensive end and the defensive tackle, and we won football games.
Pretty simple recipe.
And my father taught me how to do that.
Okay.
Okay, because the coaches never talked about moving this way and coming back this way, and this kind of stuff. They didn't teach us that.
I see. Okay.
If we'd had good coaches, we had really good players. But I'll tell you that I was the biggest guy playing football, except for one other fellow who I will not name, but who was grossly overweight. He must have weighed 400 pounds.
Okay.
So he couldn't run, couldn't walk hardly.
Right.
And so he didn't play. But I, at 210 pounds, was the biggest kid on our football team. The other tackle was 175. My friend Andy Northern played guard at 135.
135?
Our middle
Weak
linebacker.
point.
Our middle linebacker was a kid named Roland Woodruff, who is now an orthopedic surgeon in Greeley, Colorado. He, when he played, was also 135 pounds. And I later heard my coach, this is now 10 years later, happened into a bar, shooting pool with some friends. I don't know if it's 10 years, but sometime later, and Coach Lee, his name was Bob Lee, came in, and he looked around, and oh my God, there must have been 6 or 7 former football players in there. And so he put $50 on the bar and said, "We'll drink till it's gone." And he told lots of stories. And one of them that he told us was, his feeling was that Roland Woodruff was so tough that if he'd have weighed 180 pounds, they couldn't have let him play high school football.
Really?
He'd have broke people in half.
Wow.
He was a tough guy.
Right on.
So, high school, my first day at Central Catholic High School, middle of my freshman year, I was playing basketball, wasting time because the entire class was out making money by picking up corn. You know, after the harvesting, there's always stuff that doesn't get into the bin of the combine, and so we would go out and pick it up, and the farmer might pay us 50 cents a bushel, for example.
Yeah.
And so we could make a considerable amount of money so that we could pay for the senior prom when it came our turn.
Very good.
And my class was all out doing that. And when they got back, one guy came into the gym because he had to wait for the bus out to St. Labori, and his name is Tim Ziller.
Oh, recognize that name.
And Tim Ziller was the first guy I had met there. He became my best friend then, and I would say he's my best friend now, and he's your godfather.
Yes, yeah.
And they now live in, or near Greenboro, North Carolina. He lives in a town called Graham, North Carolina. And to tell you what kind of friend he is, I have a lot of good men friends. I don't know how I got so lucky.
Mm-hmm.
I really don't. A lot of men don't have close, good friends. And when I was first diagnosed with cancer, and Pat had just gotten her knee replaced, it was a tough time for us. And so Larry Berg and John Baldessari and Jay Reddington and those are my best, and John Bierke, they all said, if there's anything that we can do to help you, anything, don't be afraid to call. Well, Jay Reddington's wife made a week's worth of dinners, meals for us, and she's a good cook.
Excellent.
Okay. Tim Ziller didn't call and say, if you need anything, call me. He said, pick me up at the airport at 11 o'clock tomorrow morning. I'm coming for at least 2 weeks, but I can stay for 3 months if you need me.
Good man, that's a good friend.
Didn't even ask. Just came. And he drove me to chemo and drove Patty to her physical therapy stuff because she couldn't drive.
Right.
And we didn't know how chemotherapy was going to affect me. Eventually, we found out it wasn't all that bad, and so I could drive then after that. But Ziller came and replanted the flowers and trimmed roses for Patty and mowed the lawn and tilled the garden. And I mean, he took care of us.
It's a lot of work.
Yes.
Exacerbated by the fact that he has only one working hand.
And he only has one arm. Yeah.
Oh, good man, I did not know that.
Yeah.
It's very interesting.
Yeah. Been my best friend for a long time.
Can you talk about your mother a little bit? How maybe she met your father, she's Finnish.
My mother is a full-blooded Finn. My dad was 3/4 Irish and 1/4 English.
Okay.
His mother was half English, half Irish.
Okay.
His father was full Irish.
Okay.
And my mother was the youngest of of 10 children. Actually, she's the youngest of 15 children. 4 of them died at or near birth, and another lived for 10 years and died of spinal meningitis. But they all died before my mother was even born. So she didn't know any of that.
Wow, but I did not know there were so many siblings. No wonder the Kangas family reunions are such a large shindig.
Yes, exactly. There are a lot of people who come to
I've always wondered why there were just so darn many of those Kangases.
That's why.
Alright, so...
4 girls, 2 boys. And her father, although a apostolic Lutheran, which is a very strict sect of Lutheranism, was a very progressive man. And he wanted to have an organ in the church, and so the church immediately expelled him. He was excommunicated because he thought there ought to be music in the church.
Ah, okay.
But he was a wise man. He made his living selling wholesale groceries. So he was one of the first people in town that had a car, so that he could drive to some of the outlying cities, sell his groceries, wholesale groceries, get a list, and somebody else would deliver them, but he could get to several different places quickly in an automobile. So he had one. And the 2 boys were both dentists, and so both did very well financially, and savvy stock investors.
That always helps to grow your personal wealth.
And the 8 girls, 7 of them graduated from college. Now this was, my mother was born in 1917, my father was born in 1915. This was very unusual, that you would educate your daughters. You're going to educate your daughters for. They're going to get married and have babies and take care of the kitchen.
Right.
He was a very forward-thinking man. My mother graduated from Iowa State University, taught in Willow River, Minnesota.
What was her degree in?
Home economics,
Okay.
with a minor in English.
Okay.
And she taught at Willow River, and about that time my dad had been in the Army for a while, and evidently had asked her to marry him, and she went to her father. Now my father was a Catholic, and they were apostolic Lutheran, and she said to her father that she wanted to get married to my father, and her father, she expected him to blow up. Very calmly said, "Well, do you love him?" And she said, "Yes." And he said, "Does he love you?" And she said, "Yes." And so he said, "You have my blessing." And it was, they got married in Portland, Oregon. He was on his way to India to work on that Burma Road project, and was gone, must have been 2 years, during which time I was born, and we've already gone over that. So my mother continued to teach that rest of that year at Willow River, but then she began to be big, so she moved back to her mother's house to have me. Moved out to Grand Island when Dad did, and got out there. But we spent several summers, not all summer, but a lot of times the whole month of August, back in northern Michigan, staying at her brother Arthur's camp on Portage Lake, which is a canal that ships, big ships, can take, that cuts off about 100 miles of the trip from Duluth, Minnesota to Chicago. those boats mostly carried iron ore. And when you can cut off 50 miles of the trip, you saved a lot of money and time. So that's where we stayed. It was wonderful. We had wonderful summers. Swimming, fishing. I took my Uncle Art's boat out 4 or 5 times a day when I was in high school, and would row for 2 hours. Okay.
Good exercise.
Well, also gave me pretty good upper body strength for playing football, which is one of the reasons I was fairly proficient at that. Mother.
Yeah, and did you mention how they met?
Well, they met when my father was a star football player at the Houghton High School, where he went to high school, and my mother was a cheerleader for Hancock High School.
Oh.
And so that's how they met.
Really? Opposing high schools.
Yes.
Sure
And the towns, you know, the towns are 100 yards apart.
Right.
You know, it's only across the bridge from Hancock to Houghton.
Right.
And they both go up mountainsides. And I'm sure you wouldn't understand this, but they are fierce rivals.
Yeah. Oh, okay. I wasn't sure about that.
Yeah. Fierce rivals. My dad talks about riding sleds from the top of the mountain on the Houghton side down the several blocks. I mean, it was a long walk back up, but it was a heck of a ride going down.
I'm sure. I'm sure.
And back to Mom. Mom was quite a resilient woman, and but you had to get things taken care of before you told her. For example, in the second to last football game I played in high school, we played against Columbus St. Bonaventure. And they had a kid who I'd faced before, who had one arm and a stub here. He'd had it cut off when he was quite young in a alfalfa sickle. Okay? And so in this game, early in this game, he played linebacker. He stuck that stump through my face mask and into my eye and ripped off my eyelid.
Ouch.
Yeah. So I just had one of the student managers put a piece of cotton over it, tape it up, and I played. Because it was my second to last football game. I was not quitting.
As an aside, my son is going to start football here very soon, and I'm sure my wife is going to be extremely worried after this story.
As my mother was. And it just so happened that as a junior, I was a junior then, we were making money to put on the senior prom, so we had an after-game dance. Well, at halftime, the doctor, who was our doctor, by the way, Dr. Gloom, was walking through the locker room at halftime and saw the cotton on my eye and simply reached over and took it off.
Ouch.
Well, my eyelid stuck to the cotton. And he saw that, and he immediately stuffed it down into his cup of ice and 7-Up.
Okay.
And he said, "Come to the hospital after the game and I'll sew it back on for you." Well, there was a senior who could drive. I wasn't old enough to drive yet, who had a problem also, and he had to go to the hospital, emergency room. Doctor was going to sew his finger back on. And so I went with him, and I think it took 6 or 7 stitches, and he put my eyelid back on. I can't even tell which eye it is anymore.
I see absolutely nothing to indicate that it ever fallen off. Wow.
And so I get my girlfriend knew where I was, but she didn't tell my mom and dad. All my mom and dad knew was I didn't come to the dance, and they were chaperones.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, no, my dad was really pissed. And when I arrived, my girlfriend met me outside, and we walked in, and my dad was standing against the wall of the cafeteria where the dance was being held, and my mother was sitting in a chair beside him, and which is the whole reason for the story is that she was sitting in that chair.
Mm-hmm.
Because my dad said, "Where have you been?" And I said, "I had to go to the hospital to get my eyelid sewed back on." And my father said, "Oh, okay." Because for him, that's why I wasn't there.
Right.
My mother fainted. And since she didn't have far to fall, she was caught and didn't hurt herself. Eventually came to.
Very good.
Yeah. So we learned to take care of stuff before we told Mom.
Right.
Which was important because my father died of Hodgkin's disease at age 46.
Right, you were 16.
I was 16.
So what was that like?
I really didn't feel anything at the time because he was the dumbest guy on the face of the planet. I mean, what did he know? Nothing.
Right.
I was 16. I knew everything. I wish he had lived 6 to 10 more years, because I know from experience how much smarter he would have been at the end of that 6-year period.
Yeah, amazing how that works.
Yes, it works for everybody. I understand, but when you're 16, you don't understand that that's going to happen. You just think you know everything.
Right.
Didn't happen. But before he died, he asked me. I wanted to go to Michigan Tech and be an engineer, but he asked me to stay near home, go to the University of Nebraska, and at the you can't say party, at the reception after my father's funeral, our local pharmacist and good family friend, Bill Burke, sought me out after he had talked to my mother and, you know, the things you do at the receptions after a funeral, and said to me, after football practice on Monday, you come to the store, you're going to work for me. So I had a job, and I had a faithful mentor as well. He arranged for me to have 3 scholarships to attend pharmacy school at the University of Nebraska. The first year, I was still able to take 2 engineering courses each semester. It took a boatload of hours. But eventually, it was pharmacy that I liked, and so I dropped the engineering stuff, which was basically math and
Right.
physics and stuff that I needed anyway. So so I went to a pharmacy school.
So how did the household get supported while you were in school and your father wasn't around?
My mother worked 2 jobs. One, she taught full-time at the Grand Island School of Business. And what she taught was English and how to be hired and kept on by appropriate manners and dressing and how to conduct yourself. It's not like a beauty course, because there was no makeup stuff involved, I don't think. But how to dress